Between 1976 and 1977, Oakland County, Michigan became the hunting ground of a predator or possibly a group of predators responsible for one of the most chilling unsolved serial killings in American history. The media dubbed him the Oakland County Child Killer, but others called him the Babysitter because of the eerie way he cared for his victims before killing them. The victims for children, 2 boys and 2 girls, were abducted in plain sight, held captive for days, and murdered with precision. The boys were sexually assaulted, and all 4 were cleaned, dressed, and groomed before their bodies were discarded in prominent areas, as if the killer wanted them to be found. DNA evidence has provided fragments of the truth, but the true identity of the Oakland County Child Killer remains a haunting mystery.
It began on February 15, 1976, when 12-year-old Mark Stebbins vanished after leaving an American Legion Hall in Ferndale. 4 days later, his lifeless body was found in a parking lot, neatly dressed in the same clothes he had disappeared in. But something was terribly wrong. Mark had been strangled, sexually assaulted, and had ligature marks on his wrists and ankles, suggesting he had been bound for days before being killed. His body had been groomed, his clothes washed, and he was carefully placed where he could be easily found. The horror didn't stop there. 10 months later, on December 22, 1976, Jill Robinson, 12, ran away from home after an argument with her mother. She never made it back. 4 days later, her body was found along Interstate 75 fully clothed, her backpack still on her back. She had not been sexually assaulted, but she had been shot in the face with a 12-gauge shotgun. The killer had changed his method, but the eerie ritual remained. Jill had been fed and cared for before she was murdered. The community was now gripped by fear. Parents kept their children inside, and streets that once echoed with the laughter of kids playing now fell silent. Then, on January 2, 1977, 10-year-old Christine Mihalik disappeared on her way home from a 7-Eleven store. 19 days later, her body was found along a rural road. She had been smothered to death, her body left in plain sight. Just like the others, she had been bathed, groomed, and clothed after her death. By now, the media had given the unknown predator a name: the Oakland County Child Killer. Despite warnings, parents' worst nightmares came true once again when 11-year-old Timothy King went missing on March 16, 1977. His skateboard was found abandoned in a parking lot, and for 6 days, authorities launched the largest missing child search in Michigan history. Then came the devastating discovery. On March 22nd, 2 teenagers found Timothy's body in a ditch. He had been sexually assaulted, suffocated, and fed his favorite meal, Kentucky Fried Chicken, just before he died. The killer had cleaned and dressed him one final time before discarding him. The city of Detroit was in hysterics. Police launched an unprecedented manhunt, interviewing thousands of suspects, stopping every driver in the area, and publishing sketches of a potential suspect seen talking to Timothy. Despite 18,000 tips and dozens of arrests on unrelated charges, the killer remained a ghost. And then, the murders stopped. The investigation into the Oakland County Child Killer took detectives down a dark and twisted path, one filled with pedophile rings, wealthy suspects, and even organized crime. One of the first major leads came from an anonymous letter, supposedly written by an accomplice. The writer, calling himself Alan, claimed that he was the slave of a sadistic Vietnam War veteran named Frank, who took pleasure in murdering children. Authorities arranged a secret meeting with Allen, but he never showed up, and the lead went cold. Then came the case of Arch Sloan, a convicted child molester who owned a 1966 Pontiac Bonneville. Investigators found hair from 2 of the victims in his car, but the DNA wasn't his. This meant Sloan had either worked with the killer or lent his car to someone involved. Another disturbing theory involved Chris Bush, the son of a General Motors executive who had been arrested for child pornography shortly before the last murder. Bush had committed suicide in 1978, and inside his home, police found a blood-stained rope and a drawing of a screaming boy eerily resembling one of the victims. For years, families of the victims pushed authorities to investigate Bush further, believing he had either acted alone or was part of a larger pedophile ring. But in 2012, DNA testing ruled him out. One of the most shocking revelations came when detectives uncovered a multi-state pedophile ring on North Fox Island in Lake Michigan. Wealthy men had paid to abuse young boys, and some speculated that the Oakland County Child Killer may have been connected to this operation. Despite these leads, no arrests were ever made. In 2019, a documentary shed new light on the case, revealing that Arch Sloan had failed multiple polygraph tests about the murders, but without a direct DNA match, he was never charged. Decades later, the families of the victims are still fighting for answers. Timothy King's father, Barry King, has spent years pushing for the full release of police documents, convinced that a cover-up has kept the killer hidden. But to this day, the Oakland County Child Killer remains unknown. Was he one man or multiple predators working together? Did the killer die, flee, or simply stop killing? One thing is certain, someone out there knows the truth.
Okay, so we've got a really eerie set of articles and research here all about the Oakland County Child Killer case. So let's just jump right into it. This is one of those mysteries that has kept Michigan on edge for decades.
Yeah, it's one of those cases that just gets under your skin, you know? And you're right, the time period, the 70s, it was a different world back then. Kids could, roam free. And then suddenly, the sense of safety is shattered. I mean, can you imagine the terror that grips Detroit?
It's hard to even fathom. 4 kids murdered in just over a year. And the similarities between the cases, it's clear this wasn't just random violence, right? This was calculated. It was almost ritualistic.
Absolutely. And it wasn't like quick, impulsive acts either. Some of these victims were held for days. They were, even cared for in a way. They were groomed, dressed after death. Some were even fed before. It's just, think about that for a second. That suggests a real chilling need for control, even in death.
I mean, it's chilling, right? It's like the killer wanted to create some sort of twisted connection with the victims, even in such a horrific way.
Yeah, that's one way to look at it, and it is disturbing. But I think these details, they're a huge part of why this case has captivated and horrified people for so long. It just doesn't let go.
Okay, so let's talk about the victims. Mark Stebbins, just 12 years old. He was the first. And he was found fully dressed, like he was just sleeping.
But it was anything but a peaceful sleep, though. Mark was strangled, sexually assaulted, and he'd been held captive for days. I mean, that alone just speaks volumes about the level of cruelty involved.
And this was just the beginning. Then there was Jill Robinson, another 12-year-old. She was a runaway, found shot in the face. But she was still wearing her backpack.
And this is where it gets even more complex, Despite the violence, she had been cared for before her death. She'd been fed. This detail has always kind of perplexed investigators. It's like the killer was trying to play a role, like a caretaker role, twisted as it is.
Like they were trying to almost like dehumanize the victims while simultaneously creating some kind of perverse bond with them.
Exactly. It's like it really challenges how we try to understand what motivates these types of crimes. It's not just rage or hatred. There's something else there, something more calculated, more disturbing going on.
19 agonizing days later, 10-year-old Christine Mihalich's body was found. And again, there was the grooming, the clothing, like these chilling rituals, they were being repeated.
And you have to think about what those 19 days must have been like for her family. The not knowing, the desperate hope. It's a reminder of just how deeply these crimes affect people, the sheer terror inflicted not just on the victims themselves, but on their loved ones, on the whole community.
It's just heartbreaking. And then Timothy King, just 11 years old, he disappeared. His skateboard was found just abandoned, and 6 days later, his body was discovered. But the detail that really stuck with people, he had been fed Kentucky Fried Chicken before his death.
I mean, that detail is just, it's chilling, isn't it? It's so specific, so personal. It brings this crime, beyond just an abstract act and into this terrifyingly intimate realm.
You can almost feel the panic that must have gripped Detroit at that point. Parents must have been terrified to even let their kids out of their sight. Imagine the weight of that fear, knowing this killer was still out there.
Absolutely. This wasn't just a few isolated incidents. This was a predator stalking their community, shattering their sense of safety. And you see that in the scale of the investigation. They had something like 18,000 tips come in. Just imagine trying to sift through all of that with the pressure mounting every day to find the killer.
And yet the murders just stopped. No more victims. Did he just, decide he was done? Did he die? Did he flee? It's one of those enduring mysteries of this case.
That's the question that has plagued investigators for decades, hasn't it? I mean, did something spook him? Was it a conscious choice to stop? Or was it something completely outside, something we haven't even considered yet?
So we have these 4 young victims, a community that's been absolutely terrorized, and this massive investigation that seems to have hit a wall. So what happened next?
Well, I mean, it wasn't exactly a dead end. They had a lot of leads, and over the years, quite a few suspects and theories popped up, and, well, each one just adds another layer to this already very complicated puzzle.
Yeah, it's a case that's attracted, like, a lot of speculation over the years. Let's start with Alan and Frank. Those names from the anonymous letter, the one that claimed to know the killer's identity.
Right, that letter. It was, well, chilling, to say the least. It described Frank as this Vietnam War vet, someone with, a real sadistic side. Claimed he was the killer, and that Alan, the one writing the letter, was his accomplice. And they even, get this, they tried to set up a meeting with the police.
Wow. So did they ever catch Alan? I mean, what happened?
Nope. He never showed. To this day, nobody knows if that letter was the real deal or just, some cruel hoax. But think about the impact it had. It just threw this whole other wrench into an already chaotic investigation. It fueled so much fear.
Yeah, it's a reminder of how quickly misinformation can spread, especially in a case this big, this public. Speaking of fueling public fear, there was also Arch Sloan, right? The convicted child molester. He owned a car that actually had hairs from 2 of the victims inside.
Oh, yeah, Sloan. He was a disturbing guy, already on the radar of law enforcement, but when that hair evidence popped up, it seemed huge. But then DNA testing, which was still pretty new back then, showed the hairs didn't actually belong to Sloan.
Oh, wow. So another dead end?
Well, not necessarily. It's possible he was involved somehow, but not like the main guy. Maybe he lent his car out, or maybe, and this is a scary thought, he was part of a bigger group. He wasn't charged because of that DNA thing, but get this, a documentary from, I think it was 2019, revealed that he failed polygraph tests about the murders.
Talk about adding fuel to the fire. This case is just full of these little clues that never quite give you a real answer. And then there's that unsettling case of Chris Bush, the son of that General Motors executive. He was found dead, right? And there's potentially evidence linking him to the murders.
Yeah, Bush's case is, well, it's disturbing. He was actually arrested for child pornography right before they found Timothy King, the last victim. And when they searched his place, they found a rope covered in blood and a drawing of a screaming boy that looked just like one of the victims.
Chilling. It sounds like they were closing in on him, but then DNA testing years later ruled him out. Just another crazy twist in a case already full of them. But there's one theory that's just especially unsettling, even for a case like this. The connection to the North Fox Island pedophile ring.
Oh, yeah, that's right. This wasn't just some, local thing. We're talking about a ring that spanned multiple states with wealthy, powerful men using that island as their own personal playground for these horrific crimes.
And some people think that the Oakland County Child Killer could have been involved with them.
Some investigators have definitely looked into that theory. I mean, think about it, the way the ring was organized, their access to victims, and the fact that they could have had connections to people who could help cover their tracks. It's a disturbing thought.
But there's never been a direct link.
Nope, not yet. But it raises some seriously troubling questions about just how deep this whole thing went, how far this network reached, and whether these murders were tied to something much bigger, much darker.
This is like peeling back the layers of an onion, only to find more layers underneath. So we've talked about the victims, the suspects, even some of the evidence, but what about the families? I mean, what happened to them after all this?
Oh, the impact on those families was and is huge. Just imagine losing a child in such a horrific way and then never seeing the killer brought to justice. That lack of closure, all the unanswered questions, it's a weight they've carried for, decades now.
One of the fathers, Barry King, Timothy King's dad, he's been really vocal about his belief that there was a cover-up. He's been fighting for years to get those police documents released, convinced that the authorities know more than they're letting on.
He has. He's really become a symbol for the families and their fight for justice. I mean, he and the other families have gone through such unimaginable pain, but they've never given up hope. They've organized vigils, pushed for new investigations. They've kept this case alive in the public eye, demanding answers.
That's a real testament to the human spirit, finding strength even in the face of a tragedy like that.
It's truly inspiring. And, they've also been really instrumental in changing how missing children cases are handled today. Think about it. Amber Alerts, national databases for missing children, none of that existed back then.
So this case, as horrifying as it was, actually helped lead to some positive changes.
Absolutely. It forced law enforcement to rethink their whole approach, to really understand the urgency of these situations. It's a dark legacy, sure, but an important one. The Oakland County Child Killer case, tragic as it was, it really was a catalyst for huge improvements in how we protect kids and respond to these kinds of crimes.
Yeah, that's a bittersweet legacy, but important nonetheless. But even with all that, the main mystery still remains. Who was this killer? And why these specific children?
That's the question that's haunted investigators all these years, hasn't it? Was there something about these particular kids that drew the killer to them? Or was it just completely random? We might never know.
We've covered a lot of ground here. The victims, the suspects, the impact on the community, even how law enforcement has changed because of it. But I keep coming back to this one question. Why? What makes someone do something so horrific?
That's the million-dollar question, right? And sadly, there isn't one easy answer. Every case is different. Every killer has their own reasons. But we can look at some common threads, some of those psychological patterns that we see in these types of cases.
Okay, so what are some of the theories about, the killer's mindset? What kind of person does something like this?
Well, one theory is that it was all about power and control. They may have felt powerless in their own life, and these acts gave them a way to, exert that control over others. Over life and death, even.
That makes sense, especially given, all those ritualistic elements we talked about, the grooming, the clothing, even the feeding. It's all about control.
Exactly. But we also have to consider the possibility of deep-seated rage, maybe even hatred. It's possible it was rooted in their own childhood, their own experiences.
So the crimes could have been a way of acting out their own pain and trauma.
Could be. And we can't rule out the role of, sexual deviancy either. These crimes, they often involve a very complex mix of sexual gratification and, sadism.
That's a horrifying thought. But we have to be honest with ourselves, right? That darkness is out there. And sometimes it manifests in truly terrifying ways.
It's a tough thing to think about, It reminds us how much we still don't know about the human mind, about what pushes people towards these kinds of horrible acts.
In this case, it really shows just how complicated these investigations can be. We have this idea that evidence is always clear-cut, but the Oakland County Child Killer case just throws that out the window.
Oh, yeah, you're right. You've got DNA, but a lot of times it creates more questions than it answers, right? You have people who saw things, but memories. They can be so unreliable, especially when something traumatic happens. And then you've got the human factor. The detectives, they're under so much pressure to solve these cases. And sometimes that pressure, it can make them focus on just one thing, one suspect, and miss other stuff that's right there in front of them.
Yeah, it's like This case just resists simple answers. And for the families, the victims' families, that lack of knowing, that has to be incredibly hard.
Absolutely. They're stuck with these what ifs and whys that just won't go away. Could things have been different? Did they miss something? Was there a clue, a connection that nobody saw? It's a huge weight to carry.
We talk a lot about closure with these kinds of cases, but is that even possible if they never find the person who did it?
That's a deep question. I think for a lot of the families, the only closure they might get is in finding out who did it. It's not just about putting someone in jail. It's about getting some understanding, about, honoring the memory of the people they lost.
Barry King, Timothy's dad, he once said that catching the killer wouldn't, bring his son back, but it would give him some peace knowing that that person isn't out there anymore, hurting other kids.
And a lot of families feel the same way. They just want to make sure that nobody else goes through what they did.
The Oakland County Child Killer, it's not just about those 4 kids, it's about a whole community that was changed forever, and about how we as a society try to wrap our heads around the worst parts of human nature.
And even with all the darkness, there are these flickers of light. Like, think about how much forensic science has improved, the dedication of all the investigators, and how strong the families have been. It shows that we're still fighting for justice, even when it feels impossible.
We might never know who the killer was, but we can learn from what happened. We can remember the victims, and we can work to make the world a safer place for kids. This case, it takes us back to a time when fear was just a part of life. It makes you think about how hard these investigations can be, how evidence can be so tricky, and how we're always searching for justice.
And for everyone listening, think about this. This case is still open. What do you think really happened? Did we all miss something? Could that killer still be out there? Never stop searching, never stop asking questions, and never ever forget these kids.